Hello and welcome to another video on MuleSoft series of video tutorials on YouTube channel of tutorialspedia.com. In this video tutorial, we are going to demonstrate how we can use properties, files, and global configurations for different environments and achieve this using the options and the features which are available in Mule4 using Anypoint Studio. Here is a bit of more detail about the topics that we are going to cover in this video tutorial. Before I discuss about the topics that are part of this tutorial, let's first dig into the need of having the global configuration properties. In most of the video tutorials which I covered in this playlist for Mule4, you might have seen that whenever we are doing the configuration for any of the global element, for example, when we are configuring database connection or whenever we are configuring HTTP connection or Salesforce connector, most of the properties which are required for those connections to work, we were just hard coding directly into the configuration. For the simple demonstration purposes that we did in those video tutorials, that's fine and it will work. But in the real scenarios, in the real business scenarios, this approach will not work because most of these configurations that we do differ greatly and completely. They differ from one environment to another environment, like whatever database connection details or HTTP connection details or Salesforce connection detail that you are going to use in development environment are not going to be the same when you're going to move toward the test environment, QA, staging, or production environment. So it's important that all those configurations which you think that might change and they are going to be different for different environments, you need to avoid the hard coding of such configurations. So this is where we see the power of these global configurations and configuration files in Mule4. And what we can do in Mule4 for to avoid this type of problems is that we can create separate environment-based configurations in the files, and those files are going to be used for different environments. So you will not be needed to recreate or repackage your solution into a jar and deploy it. Rather, you will have one same solution that you created. You will just create the deployable artifacts in the form of a jar file, and then whenever you are going to deploy in different environments, you will be simply pointing to different configuration files as per your environment. So once we have explained this background and the need of having the global configurations, now let's talk about the topics that are going to be covered in this demonstration. When we talk about the environmentalization and creating separate configuration properties for different environments in Mule4, we have two options available in Mule4. We can use .properties file or we can use YAML files. We will see in detail with the examples, and we will cover both, and we will see that how they slightly differ from each other in terms of the syntax. But the purpose remains same for both cases, whether you are using .properties file or you are using YAML file. In both cases, what you are going to do is that you are going to pull off all of the configurable or environment based configurations from the hard coding into a file, so that anytime you move from one environment to another environment, you don't need to regenerate the jar file. Then we will see that how we can configure a global element for these configuration properties and refer to the file that we created. And once we are done with that, we will see another thing which is global property, and we will see that how we can dynamically select the configuration files using the global property. And in this case, what we will be doing is that we will be defining a global property, and based on this global property, if we have separate files for dev, QA, and production or any other environments, those will be picked without changing anything in the code. And we will be seeing that how we can pass this global value for this global property through the arguments. And once we are done with the properties based configuration, we will also touch how we can use YAML based configuration files, and we will see the syntax differences between properties and YAML files with this real example. And last but not least, we will see, as I explained, that we will use system arguments, and using the system arguments we will pass an argument value, and accordingly we will see that our solution will pick the required file from out of the available configuration files, and we will be seeing that that particular the values that are specified and that have been provided in that configuration file will be used. So now that we have explained exactly what we are going to see in this demonstration and this video tutorial, let's jump into the implementation part and see how we can use the power of Mule4 to achieve all this. So I have already created a new project in Anypoint Studio with the name configuration demo, and here what we are going to do first is that we are going to create the properties file, and we will see that how we can refer to that properties file and refer to all the properties that are defined within that file. For that purpose, let's go to src main resources, and here we are going to create a new file. Just right click and choose new, and we will choose file. Let's name it as dev-config.properties, as we want to have development environment configurations in this properties file. Just click finish, and here we are going to specify all the properties for the development environment. For now, just only configure HTTP connector and a response property. So we will write http.host, and we will write localhost, and we will have another property with the name http.port, and we will write as 8081. Let's use 8081 for dev environment, and I want to use another global property with the name rest.message, which will be response message, and I will just write response from development environment using properties file. So this is a simple properties file that I created for dev environment, and let's copy this and create exactly similar type of file for production environment as well. We will just use two environments, so I'll copy this and I'll paste, and I will rename it to prod-config.properties. Let me open this prod config. I will copy everything from dev and just make few changes, and for the production, since we created a copy, we already have the information, so we will use the port 8082, and I will write response from production environment using properties file. So this is the change that we have in our production properties file. Once we have created these two files, now we need to create some global element which is going to refer to these files. For that purpose, what we are going to do is that we are going to use this global elements option, and here we will have to create the global elements. Let's click on this create option, and here we will choose global configuration, and we will choose configuration properties. Here we will have to provide the name of the file. Right now we did not create a separate global property, so let's just select the name dev-config.properties and click on OK. So what it's doing is that it's directly referring to dev properties only. Okay, so in order to have separate configuration properties file, we created two files, but here we are referring to only one file. But if we want to have this selection of the properties file also dynamic, for that purpose we will again create a property. We will click on create, and in a global configuration we will choose use global property. So let's create a global property and give it a name as env, and this is going to be the default value that we are going to provide. So by default we want dev, but we will see in later parts of this tutorial that how we can provide arguments, and based on the arguments we will choose either development or production. So let's choose this as dev as default. So as soon as we created this as dev, now we need to go back to configuration properties, and instead of hard coding here as dev, we will have to refer to that $env -config.property. So now whatever will be the env value, the properties file will be selected accordingly. Okay, now we have created this configuration property, and we have also created configuration properties global element, and we have created a global property. Now let's create a HTTP connector and refer to these properties. So I'll click on create, and for the connector we will choose HTTP listener config. And here in the host, instead of keeping it as is, we will refer to the properties that we define. So we will use dollar, and then in the curly brackets we will use http dot host, and for the port we will use dollar, and we will write http dot port, and we will just click OK. So once we have created this global configuration for all our required components, now once we are saved, once we have saved this, we will go to the message flow, and we will drag this HTTP listener here, and we will refer to the same HTTP listener properties global property that we created. It's already pointing to the same. So in the path, let's write /config demo. Okay, so next what we are going to do, we are going to just put a transform message component over here, and here what I'm going to do is that I'm going to change it to JSON format, and what response I want to return is response message. This is going to be element name in this JSON, and the value will be picked from the the value we are going to pick from the configuration properties file. So the name that we gave was resp.message, and we will just refer to that. You can see here that the name was resp.message. So what we want to do is that whenever this process or this solution will be running in our Mule runtime, and we will invoke this REST API based on the HTTP listener, and the response that we will be receiving will also be picked from the global configuration file. So we are expecting that whenever we will call it for the dev environment using 8081, the response should be this one, which states that response from development environment using properties file. And whenever we will be calling it using port 8082, which is for the production environment, we should receive the response stating response from production environment using properties file. Alright, so now we are not going to do anything fancy over here. We are just going to test this one first, and by default, without providing any system arguments, we are expecting that it should run with the dev environment, because in the global properties you can see that for the global property for environment we specified dev. Okay, so now we are going to just run this solution, and without configuration elements, if we want to run it, we will just click on run without any properties. Let me show you that. So we will use run as, and if you see Mule application configure, so here normally we will be providing arguments over here, but first time we are going to run it without any run properties. For that purpose, we will just click here and run. It will take some time loading into the Mule runtime, and once it's running, we will test by invoking this service. So we can see the deployment status that it has been deployed. So let's now go to the browser. You can use any of the client, like you can try it from Postman, but I will prefer to use it since it's simple GET request. So I will just use the browser. So HTTP localhost, and I'm running on port 8081, and here I will use /config demo. So once I click OK, you can see that I got a response stating that response from development environment using properties file. Let me zoom it out so that you can zoom in so that you can see it easily. So based on the configuration that we have, we got the response. Now we want to make the change. What we want to do is that instead of running it simply for the dev environment, we want to provide the global configuration. We want to use the global configuration which we did. For that purpose, we will use system arguments. So let me right click on the project, and in the run as, we are going to select this Mule application configure. So we will do the configuration, and in the arguments we are going to write /-d env, because env is the name of the global property, and I will choose prod. So I want to run it with the prod configuration. So in that case, it will be reading from the prod config properties file. So I will apply and I will run it. So in case of production, we are using port 8082, not 8081. So once it will be running in our Mule runtime, from the client side, I will have to use port 8082 in order to invoke this API. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to change here in the meanwhile while it's loading. So it will be 8082/config demo. It's still loading, so we will wait for it, and once it is loaded and it's deployed, we will hit the service. So we can see the deployment status is mentioned as deployed. So now we can try hitting the service. So now what we expect, we are expecting response from production environment using the properties file. So if I refresh it, you can see we got the response from production environment using properties file. So this is how we are using different properties file for our different environments, and based on the provided arguments, it's automatically picking different environment files, and we are getting back the response accordingly. And HTTP connection properties are also being picked from the global configurations that we are providing in the properties file. Now in the next part of this tutorial, what we are going to do is that instead of using the properties file, we are going to use YAML file, and we will see the difference in terms of the syntax. But in terms of the performance and in terms of the in the functionality, we are expecting same behavior in both cases. So for the YAML, I'm going to create the file. So in the same folder, in the resources folder, we will right click, we will choose new, and we will create a file. And again, we will use both environments. So we will use dev-config.yaml, and we will just finish. And observe the difference in the syntax. So in this case, we have this option. We will write HTTP colon, and then we will tab it, and any of the properties which are part of this HTTP will be under this like this. So we have port, and we will use port for this one 8083, because for 8081 and 8082 I want to use for properties, and 8083 and 8084 for the dev and production in case of YAML I want to use. And here we are also providing the codes, and host, we are going to write same localhost. And then for the response, I will use resp as the main element, and within that we will have message. And for the message, we will write similar message, response from dev environment using YAML file. And in the similar way, we are going to create a copy of this for the production environment. So I'll right click, so I will just control C, control V, and I want to create the file for production. So I'll write prod-config.yaml, and in this prod config YAML, I will just change the content of this message to production prod, and for the port I'm going to use 8084. So 8083 will be for the dev, and 8084 for the prod in case of YAML based configurations. So once we have done this, now we need to make the changes into the global element for the configuration properties. Here, instead of using dot properties, we are going to use dot YAML, and we will keep everything else same. Okay, now we have already changed both our property. We have created new properties file, and the reference have been changed, and our configuration properties in the global elements is pointing to the YAML files. Okay, now once we have done these changes, let's run it again. And this time again, I want to run it without any with the default element with the default parameters, default environment property, which is pointing to the dev. So let me right click, and in the in the Mule application configurations, for the run configuration, I want to remove this. I want to run it without any global argument provided. So I will just run it, and in this case You might have guessed it already that it's going to use dev environment because the global property by default is having dev. So it will be picking dev-config.yaml file. So we will wait for it to get loaded into the Mule runtime, and once it's loaded, we will try to hit it on port 8083 because 8083 is the port that we have selected for the dev environment in case of YAML based configurations, and 8084 is the configuration for the production environment using the YAML properties file. Let's wait for it to get loaded and then we will hit it. So we can see that status as deployed. Now let's go to the browser and just change the port to 8083. And what we are expecting response from dev environment using the YAML file. Let's hit it. And we can see that as expected, we received the response from dev environment using YAML file. If you try 8084, it will not work because the application which we are running right now is with the dev environment which is using port 8083, not 8084. So if we want to run it with 8084, we will have if we want to run the production one, we will have to change the argument. So we will go to run configurations, and in the arguments we will have to specify the arguments. So by default it was pointing to dev dash d env is equal to prod. So if we use prod as the configuration here and run it, now it will be running on port 8084 as per the configuration in the prod config file, and we will be able to hit it. So we will again wait for it to run, and once it's running we will hit it on 8084, and the response we are expecting now will be this one, which states that response from prod environment using YAML file. We can see the status of our application as deployed. So let's now go to the browser and try 8084. And we can see that as expected response from prod environment using YAML file. So this way we have managed to create separate configuration files, both using properties and YAML. And whatever properties we have configured, we are seeing that the behavior of the application is as expected, and we are able to achieve the desired results. And we can also see that whatever arguments we provide at runtime, based on that we are able to fetch the required configuration either for dev or for production environment. And this way we are able to provide separate configuration for separate environments without recreating the jar file in case of the deployment. This way we did it using the Mule runtime within Anypoint Studio. But if you have to deploy it in your Cloud Hub or any of your environment, be it on premise or be it on cloud, there might be a slight difference how you are going to select these configurations. So in case of the Cloud Hub, if you deploy it in Cloud Hub, then once you deploy it using Runtime Manager, then you will have to define a property there with the name env, and you will have to specify the value for that env, and accordingly the file will be selected out of the available configurations. That's it from this video, where I just touched the basics of how we can use configuration properties files and YAML files in order to have separate environment based configurations. And I hope that the information that has been conveyed through this simple demonstration will be helpful for you. And in subsequent tutorials on this playlist, I will also cover how we can do this, use the secure properties in case of these YAML or properties based configuration files. And we will be covering more topics. Currently I'm covering most of the basic topics, and gradually we will be going into the intermediate and advanced topics. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you are able to get latest videos from the channel as and when uploaded. And for the further reading, you can always refer to other video tutorials in this playlist on Tutorialspedia YouTube channel. And additionally, as a best resource for any of the information that you want for the MuleSoft Mule4 ESP, you can refer to the official documentation from MuleSoft, where you will get a lot of information. So that's it from this video. Thank you very much.